Hi, Misha here, and recently I put out a fresh video on the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon, aka the Viper. And since it's been a little while, I thought, why not revisit its Japanese JASDF cousin, the Mitsubishi F-2. Sometimes called the Viper Zero, combining Viper from the F-16's informal name and Zero from the Mitsubishi A6M of World War II infamy. And I do actually have one new model, different variant here. These are all 1/72 scale diecast from Hobby Master, and they really kind of show the multi-role purpose of the F2, much as the F-16. But this is definitely a major variant with a larger wing, larger tail, even 2 additional hardpoints. So over here, we have the F-2B. This is one of the 4 prototypes made. And even though it's a 2-seater, it does have weapons. Kind of showing the Japanese ability to arm these up and use them for patrol, not just training. It's got some short range and medium range air-to-air missiles. And back here we have my first F-2A. This is in kind of a light ground attack role with bombs under the wings. Pretty, like I said, pretty lightly loaded, but more of an air-to-surface. They did this so they could replace the F-1. Over here we have another F-2B. This is a standard production model. Not armed up or anything. Empty pylons, just fuel tanks. They usually have the 2Bs with tanks because of the second seat. It has a little less internal tankage than the 2A. And then finally, our new one here. This is another F-2A. And this one's fully decked out with these big anti-shipping missiles under the wings. It's got 4 of those and then 4 of the current AAMs that Japan is wont to use. And this one has a lightning pod on it, unlike the other 2A. And like I said, I just recently picked this up. It was on sale and kind of thought it was just a neat setup, neat configuration. And since it did just come in a little while ago now, but generally speaking, just came in, it was a good excuse, along with the recent F-16 video, to kind of review the F-2 and all the politics and engineering and everything that kind of went into creating this plane. It is quite the story. And we'll compare it with an F-16. I think I ended up using a F-16D, a Block 52. But, anywho, with that, let's go back to the 1980s. In many ways, this aircraft exists because of politics. I've already talked with you several times about the Mitsubishi F-1. Pretty remarkable aircraft, in that it was Japan's first truly domestic design, although it looks very suspiciously close to the Supercut Jaguar, but they promise it's not. AKA Japan was borrowing a page from the Chinese playbook of copying. Anyway, the F-1 was a first step, but they only produced them in small numbers. It was an interim solution. It was also very important because up until the F-1, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force really did focus on just that, air defense. Their ground attack was virtually non-existent, and their anti-shipping capability was more important but still pretty minimized. They had used the F-86, the Japanese version. They used a version of the F-4 as well as the F-104 Starfighter. And they would soon adopt a version of the F-15 known as the the J and the DJ. Single seat and two seat. Anywho, as early as 81, 82, the initial thoughts began on what would be known as the FSX program. And they really wanted to replace the F-1, and it would be there to supplement the F-15. The F-15, of course, was geared as an air superiority fighter. The new FSX, that's hard to say quickly, would be primarily aimed at anti-shipping duties, which for an island nation like Japan, and with increasing threats from Soviet Russia and China in that era through the seas, makes sense. Air fighting would be a secondary concern. At first, they had some impulse to do it, but then they discovered, hey, the F-1 is working out better than we thought. We can put this off a little longer. But in 1985, the Japanese Defense Agency was tossing around the idea, should we make something domestically or should we just buy a foreign design and produce it here? So they laid out some specifications and sent them to 3 potential contenders manufacturers. In the US, they were interested in the F-16 and the F-A-18. And from Europe, they were interested in the new Panavia Tornado. And they essentially said, look, this needs to have good range, good endurance, and it needs to be able to carry up to 4 anti-shipping missiles and at least have room left over to carry 2 air-to-air missiles for defense. And there were other specifications, but it gives you an idea. And all 3 companies got back with them in early 86. The JDA looked at what they said their aircraft could and couldn't do, and they pretty much said, look, we told you none of these meet our specifications. Let's do our own. This led to complaints from the West German government, the Italian government, and of course the American government filed officially with the Japanese government. Therefore, the JDA had to reevaluate that spring, and this time they said, okay, can you make us a variant of your aircraft to maybe suit our needs? And they all got back with them. And at this time, Japan, politically, economically, they were doing well, and that was kind of part of the problem, at least in the USA. There were a lot of people thinking that there was a trade deficit, that Japan was getting the better of the USA, and there were a lot of people pushing for a joint project. They were hoping this would bring some money to America, also kind of give Americans a good idea of what Japan was up to, so on and so forth. There was also some scandals brewing. The Toshiba Kongsberg scandal came out. It was known, but it became public in early 87. And this was basically them doing business with Russia, despite sanctions and embargoes. Long story short, they were put in a position where they really needed to just select an American aircraft, and thus they selected the General Dynamics F-16. An agreement was announced on October 21st, 1987, that there would be a partnership, and then the next year, a letter of intent, an agreement was signed between Mitsubishi who would produce in Japan, and General Dynamics. And it was basically going to be a work share, 60-40 split, with the bulk going to Mitsubishi. But they didn't just want a basic F-16. They started with the F-16C, the current generation at the time, but they also reverted back to an old program known as the Agile Eagle from '84. And this was a study that General Dynamics had done to produce a version with a larger wing made of a composite material to give more, range, lift. So, yeah, they started there and developed a version for Japan. But while they're working, the politics get even rougher, and now Americans, or at least some politics, are criticizing the Japanese for trying to spy on American industry and filch the latest technology, yada yada. As soon as the new Bush administration comes in '89, they insist on a reevaluation, kind of an audit of the terms. The Japanese government takes offense to this, saying that they're trying to back out or renegotiate, which kind of they were, renegotiate. Congress is unhappy. A revised deal is assembled in April, and then Congress does go ahead and ratify it under protest officially. The Japanese government's unhappy. The president's unhappy. Congress is unhappy. Everyone's unhappy, therefore it's kind of all an equal, fair deal. And in 1990, the program kind of just goes forward. And they work on building what would be known as the XF2. They ordered 2 prototypes of the single seat and 2 prototypes of the 2-seat. The single seat was going to be an anti-shipping and air defense aircraft. The 2-seat was to be a training conversion aircraft, and also just one they can get their flight hours up on. However, the 2-seater was going to be fully combat capable. And the first prototype flew in 1995. Interestingly, some sources say July 7, other sources say October 7. So there's a misprint somewhere. And with that, the other 3 prototypes were built and tested. So what do we have here? Like I said, this model is of one of the 2B prototypes. So it was built in the USA. General Dynamics was folded into Lockheed Martin during this whole time, and tested by Japan. It looks like an F-16, and it's very similar, but also very different. From the top, we have a longer body. This is just under 51 feet, whereas the F-16 is just under 50. But the big difference is the wing. This does have that composite wing. It's lighter weight, helps with fuel efficiency, fuel itself, range. It also added a smidgen of stealth. The wing's about 25% larger surface. It also has a larger tail. It's about 20% larger than an F-16's. It has a new cockpit that's stronger. And, with the F-16, beginning with the Block 30-32 series, you had some with Pratt & Whitney engines and some with General Electric. I have to wonder if that whole use of General Electric didn't kind of start with the Mitsubishi here, because it does use a General Electric engine. You can tell by the narrower exhaust. It also has the larger air intake up front. So I use that engine. In fact, why don't we go ahead and compare it with an F-16. Here's that Iraqi Air Force F-16C Block 52 from the last video. You can see the much larger exhaust pipe there versus the narrower one here. And you can see the larger intake, the smaller one on this one. And overall, the dimensions of the wing and here. Interestingly, the F-2 has the option of 2 more hard points under the wings because of the larger size. The ones right next to the tip here. These are obviously ladder points for short-range air-to-air missiles. So it could carry up to 4 anti-shipping missiles or 4 medium-range missiles, essentially a Japanese variant based kind of on the AIM 120, and then 4 short-range, so up to 8 missiles. It still had the center line point for a fuel tank, plus the 2 inner points for tanks, and it could mount a pod on the chin, although this wasn't often done, at least in the beginning. Capability-wise, and this is kind of hard to say because of all the versions, but the F-16 seems a smidgen faster at about Mach 2.05, whereas the F-2 is more in the venue of right at Mach 2. But it seems to have a higher altitude of about 59,000 feet versus 51,000 for the standard American version. But again, it's hard. You have to really generalize because of how many F-16 variants have been made. Weight-wise, the American aircraft can carry about 17,000 pounds, whereas the Japanese can carry a little bit more at just under 18,000 pounds. It too carries one M61A1 cannon, although it was made under license. It's a Japanese variant with about 525 rounds. And yeah, the B here is still fully combat capable, and it's not a longer design to make room for the second person. They just have less internal fuel. So let's look at the production F-2A. So one important feature of the F-2 was it was the first production military aircraft to have an active electronic scan radar. And to accommodate this new fancy piece of kit, it had a reshaped and slightly enlarged nose radome. Later aircraft like the F-22 would use this. The Japanese needed it because of its anti-shipping and fighter defense dual roles, plus just regular navigation. So pretty fancy radar in this, at least by the standards of the 1990s. Like I said, the added point under the wings was not always used, often wasn't. And you can see the kind of uniquely shaped Japanese short-range air defense missile here, basically based on the Sidewinder, but a little different. This one has bomb there. And again, this is just a standard combat variant. So anyway, by 98, things are done with testing. They were hoping to get this in service in 99, but because of some structural stability issues, getting that composite wing to work and all that, service is delayed until 2000, with active units operating these beginning in 2001. Now, originally they were going to order about 145. This was very quickly dropped to 130 in 1995. They wanted 83 single-seaters and 47 two-seaters. So, a pretty good sized number, almost a 2-to-1 ratio. But as production was getting underway, several things were becoming apparent. Mostly these were really expensive, overcost. Some sources say 2 times the cost of a contemporary F-16. Some places say 3 times the cost of a contemporary F-16. But Japan really needed these, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces, because the F-4J was really getting long in the tooth. They had the F-15J, which was good, and they still had some F-1s active, but not near enough. So they had to replace the F-4. By 2004, they had about 78 either in service or already ordered, contractually obligated for. And so they said, you know what, let's do one more order of, 15 or so and call it good. So the initial goal of 130 was reduced to 98, and this number included the 4 prototypes. So actually 94 production models would be made. Now again, these had components made in the USA, some components anyway, by what was by then Lockheed Martin. Other components were made by Mitsubishi, and a few others were subcontracted out in Japan. But after considerable delay, at least it was finally in service. And even if it cost more than the F-16, well, was it worth it? The 1990s definitely saw the political climate change between the USA and Japan. The US had, quote, won the Cold War, and just the political attitude in DC was different. Meanwhile, rising threat from China helped the Japanese case, and the Japanese economy wasn't as strong. Meanwhile, the US economy was stronger, so that perceived gap really no longer was there. And it was a capable aircraft. It used the modern composite material. It had a good radar. It was capable of carrying the most up-to-date weapons. And it was a true multi-role fighter. Air-to-air, air-to-sea, air-to-ground. It had good range. Now, these were not capable of aerial refueling, because at the time the Japanese saw this as being too aggressive. The Japanese Constitution forbade any kind of offensive capability, so this was there to protect the home islands and Japanese interest and whatnot. And even though they cost a good bit of money, a lot of it was spread around throughout Japan. It did help modernize the Japanese aerospace industry. The metallurgy and new composites helped. And, of course, it benefited Lockheed Martin financially, too, in the USA, which makes people happy. At a time when there were a lot of defense cuts, in between the Cold War and 9/11, that is. And it did allow Japan to begin retiring its F-4J Kai fleet. Most of the ones left were kept around for reconnaissance, actually. And so by 2004-2005, the F-2 was generally being used to patrol and guard Japan against threats. And it was always known that China would be a potential threat, and yes, these would intercept many numbers of Chinese aircraft, especially as China tried to improve its own aircraft industry. But with Putin and Russia coming on the scene, around 2012-2013, they found themselves intercepting more and more Russian aircraft trying to violate their airspace. Anything from Sukhoi Su-27 fighters up through Tupolev bombers. Now, this never went hot. About the most that Japanese F-2s did was shoot pictures to prove that they were violating airspace. But this did happen, and did kind of underscore why Japan needed its military. And of course, the F-2, and it became kind of affectionately known by the pilots as the Viper Zero, combining Viper from the original F-16 and Zero from the A-6M World War II aircraft. They liked its good visibility, good controls. It was capable of making some pretty good Gs, and it had all the positive attributes from the F-16, including a reliable power plant. And pilots generally liked it, but it was not without incidents and mishaps. So here is the American-made XF-2B again. And here is the standard production F-2B. And of course, these saw quite a bit of use for training new pilots and just keeping pilots up on their hours. And I don't know, maybe sometimes you just want to fly with a buddy. Again, it was fully combat capable. The only real sacrifice was reduced range. The first crash of an F-2B came in 2007. It was attributed to faulty wiring, and luckily both pilots ejected and survived. So I wouldn't say no harm, no foul, but at least there was no loss of life. Probably the biggest loss of Viper Zeros came in 2011 during an earthquake, which, pretty common in Japan. 18 aircraft were damaged. Of these, 5 had to just be totally written off, and the other 13 would take some time to repair. This would also be the year the last F-2 would be delivered to the JASDF, so that would fulfill the contract. And like I said, in 2013, Russian intercepts went up. By 2014, with all the earthquake-damaged aircraft repaired, the JASDF reported having 61 2As and 21 2Bs in inventory and active and ready to go. And they would continue on. Another F-2B would crash in 2019. But again, both crew would eject successfully, and after being beat up a bit and having a hell of a wild ride, would be fine. Counterpoint to that, in the same year, they intercepted well over 900, nearly 1,000 times Chinese and Russian aircraft. So one reason you might see more and more crashes and just fatigue is because they're seeing a lot of use. And the same thing can be said for other Japanese aircraft. For example, their F-15s. They aren't shooting, but they're letting others know that they are watching and ready. So they are getting a lot of flight hours on these airframes. In fact, last year, around September 8th, after a flight, inspection was being conducted again on an F-2B, and a small crack was found in the wing root here. And again, this is that composite wing. that already caused delays in the aircraft even coming into service back around 99, 2000, trying to get it stable enough. And with all the hours being put on airframes over the last decade, it's kind of no wonder that there might be structural issues appearing. The incident was kind of kept quiet, classified as much as they could, but the whole F-2 fleet, A's and B's, were grounded per review and full inspection. And then it was supposed to last a month. It was actually lifted a week early on October 1st, 2020, because of just need. And just the very next day, they were at it again, performing yet another intercept, this time of a Mi-8 helicopter. So they are seeing a lot of use as we roll into 2021. But keep in mind, they only have 80 in service now. So that's about the same number of F-1s that were built. There have been several attempts at what's called the X-3 to maybe make a domestic replacement. Japan was talking with the USA about the F-22. They really wanted to do that. And since Japan would not export, they thought they might have a shot. America is not willing to let the F-22 go to anyone. Japan was hoping for an exception, but they did not get it. Instead, the Japanese have purchased some F-35 Lightnings. But the Lightning's future in Japan is not assured. They have some. It's not really clear how many they'll end up getting, or if they'll go for a domestic design. Of course, the F-15s are still flying, but they've retired the last of their F-4s, which were doing tactical reconnaissance, so they need a replacement there. There have been some upgrades to the F-2 fleet over the years. Of course, touching up the computers, the electronics. They started adding some Lantern pods or extended range sniper pods to these. Same basic design, just different companies. And of course, they've expanded their weapons so that they can use a couple of newer medium-range air-to-air missiles. But, I mean, it is a 20-year-old design. And it goes without saying that Japan has never exported these and could not. Their constitution forbids it. Yeah, here's a full production F-2B. This prototype is pretty neat that Hobbymaster did last year. They had two versions, one with ordnance, one without. Of course, I like the ordnance one because, hey, you could always just pull them off if you want it to be stripped. Funnily enough, this one only came with fuel tanks, but it came with empty pylons for the wings, so that's kind of neat. And this is the F-2A. I think it would be neat to get one with the different payload loadout, but they don't make many of these, and they're often hard to get. As far as I know, Hobbymaster is the only one to really do an F-2A or B in 1/72 scale diecast. I've seen some smaller ones, like D'Agostini does a 1/100 scale, I think, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. Those are small little models. But yeah, like I said, I had my F-16s out for the other video and thought, well, heck, 2 out of the 4 I needed for this one were here, and hopefully with the new camera it'll please some people. But they're really neat models. I like all the differences between this and a standard F-16. So what do you think? Which one of these do you like? Or maybe you don't like any at all. Maybe you're an F-15 fan. If so, I can't blame you. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, please tune in again next time for hopefully some kind of other video. This is Misha, and I'll catch you then.